The morning sun was just beginning to warm the windows of Pete's Diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor tiles. It was one of those peaceful California mornings where time seemed to move a little slower and the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. The small diner, tucked away on the outskirts of San Diego, had been serving locals and travelers alike for over 3 decades. In the corner booth, partially hidden by a large potted plant, sat a man who'd become as much a part of the diner's morning routine as the sunrise itself. He was a retired Navy SEAL, though none of the regular customers knew that detail about him. They just knew him as the quiet guy who always sat in booth 7, ordered the same breakfast, and carried a weathered wooden cane. He had a presence about him, the kind that didn't demand attention but commanded respect nonetheless. His shoulders were broad and strong, telling stories of a life lived in service, while his eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences few could understand. The cane resting against his table wasn't just a support tool. It was a reminder of his last deployment, a mission that had left its mark in more ways than one. The waitress, everyone called her Miss B, had been serving him breakfast for the past year. She'd noticed how he always positioned himself facing the door, how his eyes would briefly scan each person who entered, and how he would politely smile but keep to himself. It was like watching a guardian angel who didn't know he was off duty. This particular morning was unusually quiet. The usual crowd of early truckers had already come and gone, leaving behind empty coffee cups and the lingering scent of syrup. The cook's radio played old country songs softly in the background, mixing with the gentle clink of dishes being washed in the kitchen. The retired SEAL sipped his black coffee, his third cup of the morning, while reading the local newspaper. His breakfast plate was nearly empty, save for a few crumbs from the wheat toast he always ordered alongside his 2 eggs and turkey bacon. His dark skin contrasted with the crisp, light blue button-down shirt he wore, pressed and proper, another habit from his military days that he'd never let go. Through the large windows, the parking lot of Pete's Diner was mostly empty, just a few regular cars belonging to the staff and some local customers. The morning sun glinted off the chrome trim of a pickup truck, and in the distance, the sound of motorcycles could be heard growing louder. Miss B was just about to offer him a coffee refill when the rumbling grew more intense. The cups on the counter began to rattle slightly, and a few heads turned toward the windows. The peaceful morning atmosphere was about to change, though none of the diner's patrons could have predicted just how much. The retired SEAL didn't look up from his newspaper, but those who knew him well enough might have noticed how his hand moved slightly closer to his cane. The peaceful morning at Pete's Diner shattered as 3 Harley-Davidson motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their engines drowning out the gentle country music playing inside. The bikes themselves were impressive machines, gleaming chrome and polished black paint that spoke of hours of careful maintenance. But it wasn't the motorcycles that caught everyone's attention, it was their riders. The lead biker cut his engine first, the sudden silence almost as startling as the noise had been. He was a mountain of a man, standing well over 6 feet tall, with a thick gray beard that reached halfway down his chest. His leather vest was covered in patches and pins, each one telling a story of miles traveled and territories claimed. The other 2 riders followed his lead, their boots crunching on the gravel as they dismounted. Through the diner's windows, the morning sun cast their long shadows across the parking lot like giants approaching the building. The cook stopped mid-flip with his spatula, and Miss B paused while pouring coffee, her hand steady but her eyes fixed on the entrance. The retired SEAL in the corner booth remained focused on his newspaper, though his fingers. The leader of the Road Kings took a half step forward, his leather vest creaking with the movement. "Looks like someone's sitting in our favorite spot," he said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. His voice was gravelly, like tires on a rough road, and carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Miss B watched from behind the counter, her hands still near the phone. She'd been serving at Pete's Diner for 15 years and had never seen these men before. There was no such thing as their spot. The other customers seemed to shrink into their seats, trying to become invisible while still watching the scene unfold. The retired SEAL lifted his coffee cup with a steady hand, taking a slow step before setting it down with a gentle clink against the saucer. His calm demeanor seemed to irritate the bikers even more than if he'd shown fear. The smallest of the 3, though he still stood over 6 feet tall, shifted his weight from foot to foot, like a boxer getting ready to throw a punch. You know, the leader continued, sliding into the booth opposite the retired SEAL without being invited. Some folks just don't understand how things work around here. His two companions remained standing, creating a wall of leather and denim that blocked the view from the rest of the diner. The morning sun caught the leader's rings as he drummed his fingers on the table, creating little flashes of light that danced across the ceiling. The retired SEAL's face remained neutral, but his eyes, sharp and alert, studied each man in turn. Years of training had taught him to notice details others might miss. The way the leader's right hand stayed close to his vest pocket, how the tallest biker's stance betrayed an old knee injury, how the third man's eyes kept darting toward the door. "I'm trying to enjoy my breakfast in peace," the retired SEAL said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from experience rather than volume. "There are plenty of other booths available." He gestured to the nearly empty diner with a slight nod of his head. The leader's face darkened like storm clouds rolling in. "Maybe you're not hearing me clearly," he growled, leaning forward across the table. "This here's our spot, and some people," he paused, his eyes flickering to the retired SEAL's dark skin, "need to learn their place." The atmosphere in the diner grew heavier with each word. The cook had stopped pretending to work and stood watching through the kitchen window, a spatula gripped tightly in his hand. An older trucker who'd been quietly eating his pancakes slowly pushed his plate away and straightened in his seat. The retired SEAL's cane caught the morning light, its polished wood gleaming. One of the bikers noticed it and smirked. "What's wrong with your leg, buddy? Had an accident?" His tone made it clear this wasn't concern, it was mockery. "Something like that," the retired SEAL replied evenly, still maintaining his composure. His hand remained relaxed on the table, nowhere near the cane, though everyone watching suspected he could reach it in a heartbeat if needed. The leader's patience was clearly wearing thin as his target's continued calm. He reached across the table and deliberately knocked over the half-full coffee cup. Dark liquid spread across the white surface like an oil spill, dripping onto the retired SEAL's neatly pressed pants. Miss B started forward with a cloth, but one of the standing bikers turned and gave her a look that stopped her in her tracks. The diner had become so quiet you could hear the coffee dripping onto the floor. The retired SEAL looked down at his stained clothes, then back up at the leader, his expression unchanged, but something shifting in his eyes, not fear, but something more like disappointment. "Sometimes accidents happen," the leader said with a cruel smile. "Especially to people who don't know how to take a hint." His two companions chuckled, the sound echoing off the diner's windows. The retired SEAL reached slowly for a napkin, his movements deliberate and controlled. As he dabbed at his pants, the morning sun caught something around his neck, a chain disappearing under his collar that none of the bikers had noticed before. The leader's eyes fixed on it, his smile faltering slightly as recognition flickered across his face. Dog tags, the kind worn by military personnel. The tension in the diner had reached a breaking point. Every person present could sense that the next few moments would determine how this confrontation would play out. The bikers had started something they thought would be simple intimidation, but they were beginning to realize they might have picked the wrong target. The retired SEAL's continued calm wasn't weakness, it was the patience of a predator, and they had just made a serious mistake. The coffee continued to drip onto the diner floor, each drop echoing in the tense silence. The retired SEAL's calm response to their intimidation had clearly thrown the bikers off their game, but like many bullies backed into a corner, they decided to push harder rather than back down. The leader slid out of the booth and stood to his full height, towering over the table. His shadow fell across the retired SEAL's face, blocking out the morning sun that had been streaming through the window. "You know what? I don't like your attitude," he growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You sit there, acting all high and mighty, like you're better than us." The other customers in the diner had stopped pretending to eat. An elderly man reaching for his wallet froze mid-motion, his eyes fixed on the scene. The young mother from earlier had quietly moved her child to the booth furthest from the confrontation, shielding the little one from what might come next. The retired SEAL's breathing remained steady and controlled, a technique he'd learned during his years of military service. His eyes never left the leader's face, but his awareness extended to every movement in the room. The positioning of the other two bikers, the nervous shifting of the other customers, Miss B's hand still hovering near the phone behind the counter. "I'm not acting like anything," he replied, his voice steady and clear. "I'm just a man trying to enjoy his breakfast." He gestured to his now empty coffee cup and the stained newspaper, "which you've made rather difficult." The smallest of the three bikers, apparently emboldened by his leader's aggression, stepped forward and grabbed the retired SEAL's cane from where it leaned against the booth. He twirled it in his hands like a baton, a mocking smile spreading across his face. "Nice stick you got here," he taunted. "Bet you really need this, don't you?" The retired SEAL's eyes flickered to the cane, then back to the biker's face. Something changed in his expression, not anger, but a kind of tired resignation, like a teacher dealing with particularly troublesome students. His hands remained flat on the table, but his shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. The cook had moved from the kitchen window to the doorway, still gripping his spatula like a weapon. He'd served in the army himself years ago, and something about the retired SEAL's composure resonated with him. He recognized the controlled breathing, the tactical awareness, the calm in the face of threat. This was no ordinary disabled man. The leader, frustrated by his target's continued composure, slammed his palm down on the table. The remaining silverware jumped, and a fork clattered to the floor. "Maybe we need to teach you some respect," he snarled. "Show you how things work in our town." The morning sun had risen higher now, and the angle of light through the windows caught something else around the retired SEAL's neck, not just the chain, but what hung from it. The metal gleamed briefly, and the tallest biker's eyes widened as he caught a glimpse of what looked like military dog tags. The retired SEAL slowly pushed his ruined newspaper aside and folded his hands in front of him. The movement was casual, but there was nothing casual about the way he held himself now. Years of special operations training had taught him to remain calm in the face of danger, to control a situation without escalating it. But these men were pushing him toward a line he'd hoped not to cross. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the diner lean forward slightly to listen. "You're making assumptions about me based on what you see. That's your first mistake." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Your second mistake was interrupting my breakfast. And your third," he glanced pointedly at his cane, still being held by the smaller biker, "was taking something that doesn't belong to you." The leader's face reddened with anger, but something in the retired SEAL's tone made him hesitate. It was the kind of voice that commanded respect on a battlefield, that led men into dangerous situations and brought them home again. For the first time since entering the diner, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the biker's face. The tension in the room had reached a critical point. Miss B had finally moved her hand away from the phone, sensing that calling for help might actually make things worse. The other customers sat frozen, barely breathing, knowing they were about to witness something extraordinary. The retired SEAL remained seated, but his entire presence had changed, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. The morning sun streaming through Pete's Diner's windows had shifted, casting long shadows across the tense scene. The biker still held the retired SEAL's cane like a trophy, but his grip had loosened slightly, uncertainty beginning to creep into his posture. Something about their target's composed demeanor had started to make all three bikers uneasy. The retired SEAL slowly reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The leader tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his own pocket, but what emerged from the jacket wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of a weapon, the retired SEAL pulled out a worn leather wallet. "Before this goes any further," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of command, "you might want to take a look at this." He placed the wallet on the table and opened it with one smooth motion. Inside, nestled next to his driver's license, was a military ID card. But it wasn't just any military ID. The distinctive SEAL trident emblem was clearly visible. The leader's face went through a remarkable transformation. The aggressive sneer melted away, replaced by something between shock and disbelief. He leaned forward, squinting at the ID, then straightened up so quickly he almost stumbled backward. The color had drained from his face. "That's right," the retired SEAL said quietly. 22 years of service, 3 tours of duty, special operations." He paused, letting the information sink in. "The cane your friend is holding. I got that after leading a rescue mission in territory I'm not allowed to name. Saved 2 of my team members that day, but took some shrapnel in the process." The diner had fallen so silent you could hear the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The cook had stopped pretending to work, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd suspected something special about this particular customer, but even he hadn't guessed the full story. The smaller biker looked at the cane in his hands like it had suddenly turned to hot coal. With careful, almost reverent movements, he stepped forward and gently placed it back against the booth. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely. "We were pinned down," the retired SEAL continued, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if seeing the scene play out before him. "Enemy fire coming from 3 directions. 2 of my men were hit, not badly, but bad enough they couldn't move on their own. We had about 20 minutes before the enemy's reinforcements would arrive." He looked up at the bikers, his eyes sharp with memory. "So I did what any SEAL would do. I got them out." Miss B had moved closer to the counter, tears welling in her eyes. She'd served this man breakfast for a year, never knowing the weight of service he carried. Other customers in the diner had begun to stand, one by one, showing respect not just for his service, but for his dignity in the face of the bikers' harassment. The leader of the Road Kings looked like a man who had suddenly realized he'd been trying to play catch with a live grenade. Sweat had broken out on his forehead, and his earlier confidence had crumbled completely. His 2 companions had backed away slightly, creating distance between themselves and their leader, as if trying to separate themselves from what they'd started. "The thing about being a SEAL," the retired veteran continued, his voice carrying easily in the silent diner, "is that we're trained to assess threats, to remain calm under pressure, and to neutralize dangerous situations." He closed his wallet but left it on the table. "We're also trained to show restraint, to use force only when necessary." His eyes met the leader's gaze. "Something I'm demonstrating right now." An elderly veteran sitting at the counter slowly stood up, walked over to the retired SEAL's table, and snapped a crisp salute. Others in the diner who had served, and there were more than the bikers had realized, followed suit. The morning sun caught their movements, creating a ripple of shadows across the diner's walls. The leader of the Road Kings, a man who had probably never backed down from a fight in his life, took another step backward. His face had moved beyond pale to ashen, and his hands were visibly shaking. The realization that they had just spent the last several minutes threatening and attempting to intimidate one of the military's most elite warriors had hit him like a physical blow. The morning light in Pete's diner seemed different now, almost reverent, as the full weight of the revelation settled over everyone present. The retired SEAL remained seated, his posture relaxed but commanding, as he looked at the now speechless bikers standing before him. The diner had become a stage where a powerful lesson in humility and respect was unfolding. "Let me tell you about that last mission," the retired SEAL began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone lean in to listen. "It was supposed to be routine, as things get in special operations. We were extracting a team that had gathered crucial intelligence. Everything was going according to plan until it wasn't." The leader of the Road Kings had sunk into a nearby booth, his legs seemingly unable to hold him up any longer. His earlier bravado had completely vanished, replaced by a look of genuine shame. His 2 companions stood awkwardly nearby, their eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the man they'd been trying to intimidate just moments ago. "The enemy had been waiting for us," the retired SEAL continued, absent-mindedly running his finger along the rim of his empty coffee cup. "They hit us with everything they had. 2 of my team members were down, good men with families waiting for them back home. The choices in that moment were simple: stay together and die together, or find a way to get everyone out alive." Miss B quietly approached with a fresh pot of coffee, filling the retired SEAL's cup with hands that trembled slightly. The whole diner was captivated by his words, the morning sun casting long shadows as time seemed to stand still. "The thing about being a SEAL isn't just about the physical training or the combat skills," he said, nodding thanks for the coffee. "It's about making the right decisions under pressure. It's about putting others before yourself. It's about respect for your team, for your mission, and for human life." He paused, looking directly at the biker leader. "All human life." The cook, who had been watching from his station, wiped his hands on his apron and walked over to the retired SEAL's table. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "breakfast is on the house today." Several other customers nodded in agreement, some reaching for their wallets, eager to pay for the veteran's meal. The retired SEAL raised his hand gently. "That's not necessary," he said with a small smile. "I don't tell this story for recognition or free meals. I tell it because sometimes people need to understand that strength isn't about intimidation, it's about character." The leader of the Road Kings suddenly stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Everyone tensed, but the man's body language had completely changed. Gone was the threatening posture, replaced by something almost military in its formality. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "my father served in Vietnam. He would be ashamed of how I acted today." "The past is the past," the retired SEAL replied, taking a sip of his fresh coffee. "What matters is what we learned from it and how we choose to move forward." He gestured to the empty seats around his table. "Why don't you gentlemen join me for a cup of coffee? We can talk about your father's service." The transformation in the bikers was remarkable. The leader's eyes welled up with tears he tried to hide, while his companions shuffled their feet, looking both ashamed and grateful for the opportunity to make amends. The other customers in the diner watched in amazement as the three men who had entered like storms now sat down like chastened schoolboys. "My dad," the leader began, his voice softer now. He never talked much about his time in the service, but he always said that real strength shows itself in how you treat others. He paused, swallowing hard. "I forgot that somewhere along the way, became the kind of man he would have been disappointed in." The morning sun had risen higher now, its warm light filling the diner with a golden glow. The retired SEAL listened patiently as the biker spoke about his father, about losing his way, about the anger that had been driving him. Other customers began sharing their own stories, of service, of family members who had served, of lessons learned the hard way. What had started as a confrontation had transformed into something entirely different, a moment of connection, of understanding, of bridges being built across divides that had seemed uncrossable just moments before. The retired SEAL sat at the center of it all, somehow both the catalyst and the calm eye of this emotional storm. The afternoon sun had replaced the morning light in Pete's diner, casting a different kind of warmth over the scene that continued to unfold. What had started as a tense confrontation had evolved into something nobody could have predicted. A moment of genuine connection and understanding that would leave a lasting impact on everyone present. The retired SEAL sat back in his booth, now surrounded not just by the three bikers, but by other customers who had gradually drawn closer, pulled in by the power of the stories being shared. His coffee cup had been refilled several times, and plates of half-eaten food sat forgotten on nearby tables as everyone remained captivated by the conversation. "You know," the biker leader said, his voice carrying a new kind of humility, "we ride past this diner almost every day. Never once thought about who might be inside, what stories they might have." He looked around the room, making eye contact with other customers he'd earlier tried to intimidate. "Never thought about how much we might have in common." The retired SEAL nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's often the way of things," he said. "We see the surface, the clothes someone wears, the color of their skin, whether they use a cane or not, and we think we know their story. But every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about." Miss B, who had been listening while pretending to wipe down nearby tables, couldn't help but join in. "I've served you coffee for a year," she said to the retired SEAL, "and never knew what you carried with you. Makes me think about all the other stories walking through that door every day." The youngest of the three bikers, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "My brother's serving right now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marines. I haven't talked to him in 2 years because of some stupid fight. After today," he paused, pulling out his phone, "I think it's time to make that call." The cook emerged from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of his special apple pie, usually reserved for regulars. "On the house," he said, placing it in the center of the table. "Some conversations deserve dessert." His own military service pins gleamed on his apron, worn proudly after years of keeping them in a drawer. As they shared the pie, the biker leader reached into his vest and pulled out a worn photograph. "This is my dad," he said, showing it to the retired SEAL. "Taken in '69, somewhere in Vietnam. He always said the men he served with were the finest people he ever knew. Said they taught him what real courage looks like." He looked at the retired SEAL with genuine respect. Today, I finally understand what he meant. The afternoon crowd had started to trickle in, but they seemed to sense the importance of what was happening in the corner booth. They spoke in hushed tones, giving space to the unlikely group that had formed around the retired SEAL. The son caught his military ID, still sitting on the table, making the SEAL trident emblem gleam. "Before we leave," the biker leader said, standing up slowly, "I want to make something right." He turned to address the entire diner. "What happened earlier, the way we acted, the things we said, that's not who we're going to be anymore. Sometimes it takes meeting the right person to show you what you've become and what you need to change." The retired SEAL reached for his cane, and this time the biker leader stepped forward to hand it to him with respect. "You could have handled this differently," the biker said. "Could have fought back, called the cops, made things ugly. Instead, you taught us something about real strength." "The strongest weapon any warrior has," the retired SEAL replied, standing carefully, "is the ability to turn an enemy into a friend." He adjusted his jacket, the dog tags clinking softly under his shirt. "That's what my years of service taught me, that the greatest victories don't come from defeating others, but from helping them find a better path." The other customers in the diner, who had witnessed the entire transformation, began to applaud softly. It wasn't the kind of applause you hear at shows or ceremonies. It was quieter, more meaningful, the kind that acknowledges a profound change in the human spirit. As the bikers prepared to leave, the leader turned back one last time. "We ride through here every Sunday," he said. "Would it be okay if we stopped by again? Maybe hear more about your service, share some stories about my dad." The retired SEAL smiled, a genuine warmth replacing the tactical awareness that had been present earlier. "Same booths always here," he said, "and there's always room for more coffee and conversation." The sound of motorcycles starting up outside was different this time, not a roar of intimidation, but a gentle rumble of departure. Through the diner's windows, the afternoon sun caught the chrome of their bikes, and for a moment, everything gleamed with the promise of change and redemption.